This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. In politics, weeks can be a lifetime, but 2019 really does feel like a different time. Back before the pandemic, about a dozen Democratic hopefuls were vying to take on Donald Trump. The candidate list was headlined by Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, but there were other fresh faces too, including Kamala Harris. Perhaps because of Trump's erratic leadership or the uncertainty of COVID-19, the DNC coalesced around the steady statesman, the safe pair of hands, Joe Biden, early in the 2020 primary process. DNC leaders have been largely silent in the last 4 years, but following a halting, unsteady debate performance against Trump a month ago, several big donors immediately turned on Biden. Less than a month later, these power brokers helped push him out of the 2024 presidential race. We're still weeks away from a new nominee being officially confirmed. With each day, Vice President Kamala Harris gains more strength and more campaign money to play with, and she will almost certainly be the Democratic Party's nominee in November. Does Harris actually stand a chance against Trump? Joining me now is the New York Times Astead Herndon. Astead Herndon is a national politics reporter and the host of the politics podcast, The Run-Up. In 2019, Herndon was the Times campaign reporter for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Is this amazing story, Astead, of an incumbent president on his way to being renominated by his party, departing the race with a little over 100 days to go, as much a story about money as politics?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that one thing I learned, even in covering Harris in 2019, is that when a campaign comes to an end, when a candidate gets out of the race, it's almost always about money. Back then, Harris didn't make it to the Iowa caucuses partially because her big donors dried up and she couldn't pay her bills. And this somewhat is what happened to Joe Biden ever since the debate. Now, that debate reinforced a lot of voters' baseline concerns with Biden, which was the fear that he was too old to serve in the second term. But frankly, the voters have been pretty consistent on that front for almost a year or two now. We've been seeing evidence and reporting that's been saying that voters thought that Biden wasn't going to make it for 4 more years, or they didn't like the idea of an 86-year-old second-term president for a while. And so when people ask what actually shifted over that time, it's really two things. The elected officials started listening to those voters more and coming out saying they didn't support him, obviously. And then the thing that was happening behind the scenes was Biden's biggest donors were so shook from the debate that a lot of that money started drying up. We heard from Robert Wolf on the show, who's a member of Biden's National Finance Committee, the group of people who give the most money to the campaign. And he said they had a meeting with the 600 biggest donors of the campaign and senior aides in the days after the debate. And they had 2 questions. How are you all going to come back from this? And what's the polling really say? Is there a route to victory? He said pretty clearly they did not get an answer to those 2 questions. 20% of the donors left the call before it was even over. And he was like, by the time he got off of that, it became clear to him that Biden wasn't going to survive. Because if those type of folks aren't going to give you enough money to really grow the campaign, it's just a matter of time.
I want to hear more about that donor call because in the pandemic-inspired age of Zoom, maybe a lot more people than before may be able to imagine calls with large numbers of participants. You're talking about 600 people. What were the table stakes? How do you get into that virtual room?
Well, you have to be a member of a kind of top-tier group of donors. That really requires, probably 25,000 or more in a lot of cases. And some individual events, people have written $100,000 checks. These are the type of people who get the pictures with the presidents, who get to call them and say what their concerns are. These are the type of people who don't go through regular channels to get their voices heard. They go directly to the campaign with those questions. And so the campaign knew that. And so it sets up this call with this biggest group of donors to try to allay fears about the fallout from the debate. But the problem became they didn't really have an answer for the path ahead. And so I think it is not just the amount of people on the call. It's the amount of money that is generated from those type of groups. And if Democrats cannot tap into those places, then the route to growing a campaign, it gets a lot harder because we already know Biden wasn't really killing it on the small dollar front, right? He wasn't really raising a ton of money for your individuals who go to Act Blue and they give $25, $50 here and there. What he's been doing pretty good at is going to the places where Democrats call their ATMs, the New Yorks, the LAs, the Bay Areas, the places where you have a lot of kind of wealthy liberals who are used to giving big dollar sums to presidential campaigns. But what they also expect is for that money to feel like it's going somewhere that has a viability. And so when that viability kind of pact was broken, it just started a kind of ticking clock. And you add in polling that ended up getting worse for the Biden campaign in the time after the debates. And so if you have battleground states going in the wrong direction, that's how you get Sherrod Brown coming out and saying you should drop out. That's how you get John Tester in Montana saying you got to come out and drop out. If 70% of voters are saying they think he's unfit for a second term, that means a lot of the vulnerable House and Senate Democrats, that position the Biden campaign was putting them in was not tenable. And so if the hold on your party is collapsing and your hold on big donors are collapsing, that's not a viable campaign. And so that's how we got to the moment of Sunday.
The astonishing thing about your story is not that such a call happened, is not that big donors had concerns, but that there were no good answers. It seems to me that you don't even have that call until you've got all your ducks in a row and you've got your plausible answers ready. To hear you tell that story where they were not able to allay those fears because it sounded like they hadn't even really thought of good alibis yet.
Well, I would say the Biden campaign was living in denial about this issue for more than a year or so. They didn't have good answers when we asked them a year ago. What about all these people who think he's too old for a second term? Their basic answer was that, the policy accomplishments will matter more. Donald Trump being scary will matter more. When I talked to Ron Klain about 3 months ago about this same question, his only real kind of concrete answer was watch him in the debate. He'll disprove you at the debate. So once they set up the debate as a test for them on this front, and so when they're coming out of that, they had already flunked the litmus test they had set up on that question of age. I don't think they had any answers because, frankly, there weren't clear answers about how they were going to reverse course on this front. It was hard to see what the route forward was. Really, the only thing we got from them was a kind of head in the sand stubbornness to say, in the end, things will change. That's not enough for people, particularly when the stakes are so high.
There are reports that the Biden inner circle, even at this late date, is pretty sore, angry that donors turned on him in the way that they did. Is that a legitimate point to make or something that they're just going to have to mutter about in late-night bull sessions in Wilmington?
I know that they're angry. I know that they feel like he was pushed out by a kind of a group of maybe media or donors or kind of public perception. But they have no one to be mad at outside of themselves. They could have thought about this issue a lot earlier than they did. They could have come at this more directly than they did. Think about it. In the time after the debate, Biden switched up his messaging, said, I've lost my fastball, but I still am someone who understands this stuff and experience. Those were things he could have been saying for years now. It was apparent to literally anyone with eyes that this was not the same candidate you had seen in this kind of public life prior. And they were, frankly, refusing to acknowledge all of those steps up until the debate made it impossible for them to ignore. While I certainly understand why they are frustrated, it doesn't really ring that true to me because it's not that the donors were saying something that the public wasn't. In fact, the donors were some of the last people to arrive at this point, and they were ignoring a lot of public concerns. And to me, that was just such an absurd position for them to take.
I think in another time, this might have been a good moment to talk about the role of money in campaigns. But things are happening so quickly, and the thing has been upended so abruptly that I think we're going to miss that moment. But those big money people are really important for all the 6,000 text messages and emails that my wife gets about giving $5 and $3 and $10. She's not where it's at, is she?
No, and I mean, it's only proven by the access that they get, the fact that the Biden campaign feels the need to justify the debate to them way before they ever talked about the debate to the public. shows you where a lot of the kind of most important voices in these things are. But you're right that, but we've also seen small dollar donations take up a different role in politics right now. Since Kamala Harris has come to the top of the ticket, Democrats have raised $100 million through Act Blue and through that kind of small dollar fundraising. That only shows you that there was energy on the ground. There remains a strong anti-Trump coalition. There remains a lot of people who were willing to get involved in this election if the options they weren't presented with didn't cause them such distaste. And so one of the things I think is important is, although we know that kind of big money and those kind of political insiders matter to the decision-making a lot more, their pulse on the electorate is not a good one. It's not an accurate one. And so a lot of times they are operating from their own beliefs. And this is the same group of people who a year or two ago were telling me that Kamala Harris was a figure who could not unite the Democratic Party. And now that seems really ridiculous.
Let's talk some more about small dollar donors, because people don't necessarily understand right off the bat what their importance is. First off, you get to brag about how many unique donors there are, right? Which gives you the illusion of having a big army instead of a small one.
Yeah, and it's energy that they really try to point to them as. The average donation not being that much, the first-time donors, the amount of donors you have. It could be a proxy to show that the campaign is reaching different types of people or that, it is expanding past the ardent base. The thing I would say, though, is that the interest of small dollar donors are sometimes the more kind of rabid fans outside of your median electorate. If you're a presidential campaign, you have multiple fronts you need to appeal to. You need to appeal to those big donors. You need to appeal to party insiders. You need to appeal to small dollar donors. But that's basically still, none of those groups are where the election is won and lost. If you talk about your kind of median voter who doesn't really pay that close attention to politics, they are certainly not giving money. If you talk about your independent or swing voter who is choosing kind of late breaking based on what a candidate says, those are very different values than the type of people who donate to campaigns. And so in the early stages of a race, you oftentimes have a candidate appeal more to one slice, and then we see the natural pivot when we get to the general election and they care more about the middle and others. But that's a little bit different now because I think some of the incentives have changed. A lot of Democrats drive a lot of small dollar donations by going on MSNBC, by going on liberal programming. There's ways that you can kind of keep yourself in your kind of zeitgeist, the same way Republicans have Fox News, have kind of MAGA ecosystem and the like. When we think about elected officials, they have greater incentives now to stay within those silos because they drive so much of that money, even though those silos are actually really distinct from the places where they win and lose elections.
You were careful to specify early. Is the idea that as we get closer to the actual election day, that those concentric circles widen and capture more possible donors?
It could be. And I think that's partially true. I mean, let's look at this week. The amount of people who are donating to Vice President Harris is now the nominee. I think that's the type of money that doesn't just come from an ardent Democratic base. That's the type of money from people who don't give often, who like the idea of a Black woman at the top of the ticket, who like the idea of energy or a younger person. And I think also like the idea of stopping Trump as the main goal. We know that the kind of biggest coalition, the kind of broadest, most ideological, diverse coalition in national politics right now is the anti-Trump one. It helped Democrats through the 2022 midterms. It helped Joe Biden take over the White House, even though kind of Republicans were united. And it's frankly the thing that he has been struggling to cobble together. And so I think what we see is as we get closer to November, as the stakes get more real, as more people tend to weigh in, you're going to see the candidates have to appeal to that slice. And so one of the things that was benefiting Donald Trump was that Joe Biden was so unpopular that it really didn't cause him to have to grow his coalition. Donald Trump was not in the position of having to appeal to new types of people because the swing voter, the middle, the type of person who we often talk about as being where the electorate hinges. Yeah, they didn't like Biden. They didn't like Trump. They were kind of double haters, right? Which actually made Trump's position easier. It is more complicated if he's going to have a Kamala Harris on the other side who's making active appeals to those people and who they don't have as rigid of a unpopular view as. And so I really think the race has been reset in terms of its audiences because, frankly, Trump was allowed to exist among his base more comfortably because the other side's now have a candidate who can campaign in a lot of places and have a message that could appeal to a broader group of people. He now has that.
Kamala Harris has been a candidate for national office and the vice president of the United States for 4 years now. More than 4 years since you covered her abortive presidential campaign. Is there a difference? And will she be able to seize the moment more effectively than she did in late 2019?
Yeah, I think a couple things are different that are really important. One is I think you have a candidate who will be more comfortable on their core issue than they were in 2020. When we think back to that primary, Harris got thrown off of her own prosecutor record because of the ideological push and pull between progressive and moderate wings that was happening in that primary. The language around criminal justice reform, around prosecutors, was quite different than it is now. And she frankly let it stray from her willingness to own her own career. And so it was odd at the time that other candidates were putting out criminal justice reform plans. Other candidates were talking about being tough on crime and things like that. And things that were in her record, but she was unwilling to do. I think that's different now. And she's going to be able to have a clarity of message. We've already seen that this week about her talking about, I've locked up criminals and fraudsters before. She's going to be more comfortable on that. The second thing I think has changed is the Dobbs decision. It has clarified an issue for her that she did not have 4 years ago. And she's frankly been the best messenger for the White House on the issue of abortion for the last 2 years. That is the Democrats' best offensive weapon when it comes to appealing to people across the board. And they now have a messenger who, unlike Joe Biden, who didn't want to say the words abortion, who was fairly uncomfortable with embracing it as an issue, they now have a messenger who's better suited on that. The third thing I would say is the general is different. She doesn't have to lay out a big vision and agenda. She just needs to cobble together the anti-Trump coalition again. And so the burden on her as candidate has completely shifted from one who has to lay out an affirmative view of kind of how each issue could go to being someone who can lean on the Biden-Harris policy accomplishments and also refocus the race on Donald Trump. And so you hear the word Project 2025 out of her mouth every couple sentences now, because that's going to be their goal, is to not make this about her, but to make her a vessel for rejecting Trump. Biden did not have that ability because of the fundamental concern about his age. But she does, because she simply has less baggage than him. And so I think those things have really changed from 4 years ago to now. But we should say that there's still some questions that remain. She was not comfortable with kind of answering questions about herself. You know, she was often pulled between advisors' decisions. She switched messages like every couple months. She's someone who doesn't really work from an ideological core. And so that can lead her to lot of different policy kind of thoughts. I remember when she would do those CNN town halls, they would ask her about something and she would say, oh, I think we should have a conversation about this. And it became she said it so much, it became like a meme that what does she really believe in? Those questions will still be there, I think. But I think the task is so different that I don't think they matter as much.
Well, these have been amazing days since Joe Biden finally made it clear he was getting out. I want to talk about the two parties and their reactions. Let's start naturally first with Democrats. In the early hours, there was contrarian yada yada about, well, maybe we shouldn't just turn this into a coronation and maybe we ought to have a real open convention and a series of mini primaries. And there was all this stuff that just sounded like, I don't want Kamala Harris to be the nominee. Let me talk into being ways that I could make that not happen. It was really weird to watch. And it seems like that just got blown out of the water pretty quickly. Fair?
It did. And I think there's a couple reasons why. One, the fears about Harris were such that it didn't surprise me that some people were saying maybe we should have an open convention and find the best type of candidate. Because a lot of people, these are the same people who were telling me last summer that they did not think that she was the vessel to take over the Democratic Party in that coalition. Some of those fears still persist. But with the with the lack of time they have ahead of them, with the kind of unprecedented situation, there were some structural reasons why Harris was always likely to be the nominee if Biden stepped down. She's the only one who can kind of seamlessly take over the staff and money that is in the Biden-Harris coffers, which is a hugely important factor. Two, I think they would face a lot of questions about this being a kind of anti-democratic act if it wasn't the person who was selected under the premise that they would step up if the president couldn't do their job, right? If you were to install a Whitmer, Shapiro, Gavin Newsom right now, that would be the act of a party insiders without any word from the electorate overall. I think it would continue the sense of kind of insider haughtiness that we've seen from them from the last couple of years. But I don't think that's really the same with her. I do think you can say a story that Americans voted for a package and Americans voted for a number two that would step up in case of an emergency. And I think the debate constitutes a little bit of an emergency. And so I think that there was always a kind of reasoning that centered around her. And the other thing, and this is obvious, we're talking about a historic figure, and I think some of that has been lost because I think people have just come to accept the idea of a woman, a Black woman, a South Asian woman as vice president. It was going to be very hard to skip over her in the process without those things becoming front and center again. I think there was a lot of political natural reasons to come in, but you also had a candidate in her who worked the phones, who locked down those endorsements, and then got a public response that was so overwhelmingly positive from Democrats. It didn't create enough space for someone to really jump in.
The ink was hardly dry on the Biden announcement when 50 state chairmen had already been heard from.
Yep.
And by the next day, more than 1,000 delegates to the convention in Chicago. So even if you wanted to make a fight out of it, it would have promised to have been so ugly that it's like having guns in both hands to shoot yourself in both feet.
Absolutely. And there are some donors, right, who would prefer that. But the idea that you would tell the public that, oh, psych, we chose this lady, but we didn't really mean it, was always kind of ridiculous to me. When they were making this selection of her as VP 4 or 5 years ago, they did not do it with this in mind. They very explicitly were saying that Joe Biden was going to serve 8 years, that he needed a governing partner, and that the open question of who would succeed him in terms of the leader of the Democratic Party will be fought amongst themselves. And so there are ways that the Biden campaign could have set her up more explicitly in the lead up to this, and they did not. There was a lot of tension between Harris' world and the White House, partially because some of Harris's allies thought they were intentionally sabotaging her. So one woman told me in the story that I wrote that she felt that they were doing it intentionally to not magnify the age issue, right?
Jimmy Carter explicitly made Walter Mondale a governing partner. He called him the most responsible, most tasked vice president in history. Bill Clinton did something similar with Al Gore. There was nothing like that, a project to build up Kamala Harris in Biden world. And we were getting pretty late in the game here.
Absolutely. And that was a choice that they made. And, in my experience, covering some of that and doing this profile last year, it was clear that not just Biden world, but the larger ecosystem of Democrats, with an eye towards 2028, was not setting her up for success. And were somewhat more curious in their other options for getting there than the natural transition of her to the top of the ticket. I don't think it's to say they have completely flip-flopped on her, but I do think they know that they were underrating the fact that this was the person who could get them out of the jam. And there was a lot of people who saw this for a long time. I talked to Clyburn. I talked to a lot of the Black officials at the time. And a lot of the times when I was asking broader Democratic ecosystem, hey, isn't she going to matter in 2024? A lot of people think Biden's old. They were like, oh, no, this is all about the top of the ticket. People don't vote on VPs, blah, 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 blah. I would ask some other people, people who helped her get to that position, particularly the kind of Black elected class of D.C., and they were like, that's nuts. She will be a hugely important figure for making people comfortable with the idea of Biden's second term, even if he made it there, much less the Biden we saw over the last several months.
Now on to the Republicans, with the caveat that social media is not real life, my threads immediately started to fill up with pictures of her parents, pictures of her with boyfriends as a younger woman, speculation about her sex life, about her legal ability to run for president of the United States because her parents were not citizens at the time of her birth in Oakland, California. It's like they're refining the birther game. They're going to concede that Oakland, California is indeed in the United States, but now find a problem with her parents. I don't think it's an accident. I also don't think it's an accident when sitting members of Congress are already calling her a DEI hire. It's quick. It's happening really quick.
Yeah, this is going to be their line of attack. They're going to try to minimize her as leader based on their idea that she was only chosen because of race and gender. And I also think they're going to play the same kind of misogynistic cards that they played when she was running for president initially. That's going to include a kind of re-examination of her past relationships. That's also going to include a really kind of icky birtherism-y style belief about who is authentically Black and not. The only thing I would say is, yes, those things are happening, but I don't know if they're happening successfully. The idea that Donald Trump or like a MAGA ecosystem is going to sufficiently call a woman who not only, grew up in a Black community, doors away from the Black Panthers, went to Howard University, and has a Black life. There's a lot of things I would say about Kamala Harris, but Kamala Harris is Black, It's not like some inauthentic figure, And so I just think it's kind of ridiculous that they think that those things can land with people who have eyes, who understand Black folks, who understand that there's a lot of different ways to tell that story. But one thing I would say, and this is the thing that we put in the piece, is nobody made Joe Biden announce those litmus tests for race and gender before he picked her for VP and before he picked Ketanji Brown Jackson for Supreme Court. He did that because he was trying to shore up support in the critical stage of the primary, and it would benefit him. He could have chosen Kamala Harris on the basis of her qualifications without ever promising to pick a woman before. He could have chosen Ketanji Brown Jackson based on her qualifications without ever saying he was going to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court. He did that for political reasons. One of the things I always point out is the DEI hire framing can both be racist or can be an attempt to minimize an accomplished figure, and it could be an outgrowth of a liberal institution that used those pledges basically for their own political gain.
Does this make the choice of J.D. Vance suddenly look very different?
Oh, absolutely. It was a little weird at the time, in my opinion. It reflected a supreme maximum level confidence that Republicans had going into the RNC. I was there. They were convinced nothing changes this race, and they were going to win. And I would say that probably made sense as long as Biden stayed in. That they were right, that he had a fundamental problem with the electorate. And that was the thing that was dragging the rest of the party down. But now, I think their whole playbook has been torn up. That's not just their attack ads and messaging, but even the selection of Vance, someone who has a worse abortion record than even Donald Trump. And so if you're Kamala Harris, the selection of J.D. Vance makes your pitch on abortion easier. And I think Vance, as a untested kind of national candidate, and specifically as someone who has close ties to a kind of ultra-conservative wing specifically on the issue of abortion, are now much greater liabilities than they were 10 days ago.
That's Astead Herndon. He's a national politics reporter, host of the political podcast The Run-Up. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Before we go, we have two exciting political programs to announce. On Tuesday, July 30th, Commonwealth Club World Affairs will host a week-to-week roundtable featuring some of the Bay Area's best political minds. And on Monday, August 12th, a week before the Democratic National Convention, I'll be live in San Francisco for a special DNC preview with the Lincoln Project's Stuart Stevens. You can buy tickets at commonwealthclub.org. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry and Ann and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.